Evelyn Hart had always been an outsider. While the residents of the gated community of Willow Creek spent their weekends hosting garden parties and bickering over the color of their shutters, Evelyn was busy fortifying her home. It wasn't paranoia that drove her, it was practicality. Years of working as a private security consultant had taught her that the world was unpredictable, and the only person she could truly rely on was herself. Her house, a modest two-story structure, sat at the edge of the neighborhood, right against a dense stretch of woods that most residents avoided. The land had a unique feature that had drawn her to it when she first moved in, a decommissioned Cold War-era bunker buried deep beneath the property. Forgotten by most, the bunker was a relic of a time when people believed nuclear war could come at any moment. Evelyn had modernized it, turning it into a fully functional underground shelter equipped with solar power, backup generators, and a deep well that ensured she had water even if the rest of the grid collapsed. Evelyn didn't advertise the bunker's existence. Most of the community remained unaware of how prepared she truly was. But if anyone ever tried to corner her, they would quickly learn that Evelyn was not someone who panicked easily. The people running the neighborhood association, however, had long disliked her independence. They preferred obedience, control, and conformity, values that Evelyn had no interest in. She refused to attend their meetings, ignored their endless notices about community guidelines, and openly challenged their attempts to dictate what she could do with her own property. She had bought the land outright, with no liens, no shared obligations, and no intention of ever bending to their ridiculous demands. The worst of them all was Margaret Langston, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Margaret's power was based entirely on the fact that she had nothing better to do than meddle in other people's lives. She was the type of woman who would threaten a lawsuit over a mailbox being the wrong shade of beige or harass a single mother because her kid's bike was left on the sidewalk for 2 minutes. Margaret believed in order, but only when she was the one defining it. Evelyn had made the mistake of underestimating how vindictive Margaret could be. It had started with fines, arbitrary penalties for nonsense like excessive foliage in her backyard and unauthorized modifications to her garage. Then came the passive-aggressive threats, letters implying that her property might be subject to inspection or that the community reserved the right to enforce certain regulations. Evelyn ignored them. She wasn't a fool. She had read every line of the contracts when she bought her home, and she wasn't bound by any of their so-called rules. Margaret's frustration boiled over when she realized she couldn't force Evelyn to submit. And when the news broke that a Category 5 hurricane was heading straight for Willow Creek, Margaret saw her opportunity to strike. The storm was being called one of the most devastating in recent history, with winds exceeding 160 miles per hour and an expected storm surge that would flood most of the coastal regions. The governor had issued mandatory evacuation orders, and the city was in full panic mode. Supermarkets were emptied, gas stations ran dry, and people who had spent their entire lives trusting the system suddenly realized that the system was not prepared to save them. Evelyn, however, had been prepared for this for years. She had more than enough supplies, power, and infrastructure to outlast the worst of it. She wasn't about to waste hours sitting in traffic trying to flee when she had a bunker built to withstand disasters just like this one. She watched as her neighbors frantically boarded up their windows and packed their SUVs, but she simply locked down her home, activated the secondary power grid, and secured the bunker entrance. Then, just as she was about to descend into the shelter for the night, she saw movement on her security monitors. At first, she assumed it was just stragglers leaving the neighborhood, but when she zoomed in, her stomach tightened. Margaret was there, along with several other members of the community board, and they were walking straight toward her house. They weren't just checking on her, they were coming for her. Evelyn switched to audio surveillance and immediately caught the conversation. "She's still here," one of the men whispered. "I told you," Margaret hissed. "She's not leaving. That bunker of hers is probably better than any shelter in the city." "So what's the plan?" another voice asked. Margaret smiled. "We're going in." Evelyn's hands tightened into fists. These people weren't coming to ask for help. They were coming to take what wasn't theirs. Evelyn switched the security feed to night vision. Margaret and her people were already prying open the gate, forcing their way onto her property like looters. They thought she wouldn't fight back. They thought she would be weak, isolated, vulnerable. They had no idea what they were walking into. Evelyn didn't move immediately. She knew better than to react on impulse. Even though the sight of Margaret and her people violating her property made her blood boil, rushing out in anger would only escalate things too soon. Instead, she took a deep breath, her eyes locked on the security feeds, analyzing the situation the way she had been trained to in high-risk environments. Assess first. Act second. She counted 5 people: Margaret, her ever-present lapdog Richard, and 3 other board members she only recognized from previous conflicts over absurd neighborhood violations. They moved with a mix of urgency and hesitation, the kind of nervous energy that came from people who knew they were doing something illegal but had convinced themselves they were justified. That was exactly what made them dangerous. Margaret was leading them toward her house, motioning for the others to hurry as she whispered orders that were barely picked up by the microphones. They were planning something specific, not just a desperate attempt to seek shelter. Evelyn's stomach tightened as she switched to the thermal cameras that covered the edges of her property. The storm winds were already picking up, trees bending under the force of the incoming hurricane. The air was thick with tension, and the city lights in the distance were flickering, a sure sign that the power grid wouldn't last much longer. Once the blackout hit, all hell would break loose. She turned her focus back to the intruders. Margaret reached Evelyn's back porch first, trying the door handle. Locked. She whispered something to Richard, who then pulled out a crowbar from his coat. Evelyn's expression darkened. So that was the game. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a plea for help. This was a hostile takeover. Margaret and her little gang weren't just here to ask for shelter. They were here to take it by force, believing that Evelyn wouldn't be able to stop them. Evelyn exhaled slowly and flipped the first security switch. Outside, the exterior floodlights snapped on, blindingly bright against the pitch-black night. The group startled like cockroaches caught in the open, shielding their eyes and stumbling back. "What the hell?" one of them hissed. Margaret recovered first, throwing a glare toward the nearest security camera. "Evelyn," she shouted, her voice dripping with fake authority. "This is ridiculous. You know the situation. You have a shelter, the whole neighborhood is evacuating, and we need somewhere safe to ride out the storm." Evelyn took her time responding. Let them sweat. Let them know they weren't in control. She pressed the button for the external speakers, her voice smooth but firm as it carried through the yard. "This is private property. You are trespassing." Margaret scoffed, putting her hands on her hips like a scolding mother dealing with an unruly child. "Don't be dramatic, Evelyn. We are your neighbors. This is a crisis, and we're acting in the best interest of the community." "You're acting in the best interest of yourselves," Evelyn corrected coldly. "Leave. Now." Richard gripped the crowbar tighter, shifting uncomfortably as the wind howled around them. "Come on, Margaret. Let's just—" "No," Margaret snapped, shooting him a furious look. She turned back toward the camera, stepping closer, her expression shifting from frustration to thinly veiled contempt. "I tried to be reasonable. I tried to explain, but you've made it clear you don't care about anyone but yourself. That's not how a community works, Evelyn. You don't just get to lock yourself away and let the rest of us suffer. You're hoarding resources while people are scared, and that's not acceptable." Evelyn almost laughed at the sheer audacity of this woman. "I owe you nothing," she replied calmly, though her fingers itched to tighten into fists. "And you have 10 seconds to get off my property before I take action." Margaret narrowed her eyes. "You wouldn't." Evelyn flipped the second switch. A sharp mechanical clicking noise echoed through the yard as the exterior defenses activated. The automated system extended metal barriers along the lower windows, reinforcing the house against forced entry. The electric locks on the perimeter fence engaged, ensuring no one else could sneak in from another side. The soft whirring of unseen servos adjusting security mechanisms filled the night air. Richard took an instinctive step back. "Margaret, I don't think this is a good idea." Margaret was too deep into her self-righteous delusion to back down. "Oh, grow a spine," she hissed at him before turning back to the house. "You're making a mistake, Evelyn. You can't just cut yourself off from everyone forever. You think you're safe down in your little hole? You think your precious bunker makes you untouchable?" Evelyn didn't reply. Margaret's lips curled into something cruel. "We know about it." For the first time, Evelyn's pulse spiked. Margaret smirked. recognizing the flicker of surprise in Evelyn's pause. "That's right," she continued, her voice smug. "You think no one's been watching? We've seen you bringing supplies in, working on those home renovations you pretend are for your basement. You thought no one would notice how much fuel you've been storing, how much food. We've been talking, and you know what? We decided that bunker isn't just for you." Evelyn felt an eerie sense of calm wash over her, the way it always did when situations turned from mild threats to serious problems that needed solutions. Margaret had made two fatal mistakes. First, she had assumed Evelyn would ever allow herself to be bullied into surrendering. Second, she had announced out loud that she and her people had been watching Evelyn for a long time, documenting her every move. That wasn't just an invasion of privacy. That was a security breach. Evelyn reached beneath her desk and pulled out her sidearm, a customized SIG P320, loaded and ready. She wasn't planning on using it yet, but the situation had changed. Margaret and her people weren't just panicked neighbors looking for shelter. They were organized, deliberate, and had been waiting for the right moment to act. She cut the exterior lights, plunging the yard into darkness once more. Margaret's smugness vanished. "Evelyn," she called, her voice suddenly uncertain. Evelyn switched the external speakers back on, but this time she kept her voice ice-cold, devoid of emotion. "You shouldn't have come here." Then she cut the feed completely, leaving them outside with nothing but the roaring wind and the first heavy raindrops of the hurricane slamming into the pavement. Margaret might have thought she was in control when she stepped onto Evelyn's property. She was about to learn just how wrong she was. The storm raged outside, but the real battle was about to begin underground. Margaret and her group had forced their way into the bunker, but Evelyn was ready. She had trained for situations like this, and she wasn't about to let anyone take what was hers. As the heavy blast doors sealed shut, trapping them all inside, Evelyn knew that this was far from over. The storm outside was still raging, and now they were trapped together deep underground with no way out. Margaret stared at the reinforced entrance, then back at Evelyn, realization dawning on her face like a slow-burning fuse. "You locked us in," she whispered, disbelief twisting into rage. "You crazy bitch, you actually locked us all in." Evelyn's expression remained unreadable. "You wanted in so badly," she said coolly. "Now you get to see what surviving a real crisis looks like." Margaret's eyes flicked to the control panel, but it was already too late. The storm outside was still raging, and now they were trapped together deep underground with no way out. The heavy blast doors sealed with a final echoing thud, the reinforced locking mechanisms grinding into place with an almost ominous finality. The temperature in the bunker felt like it dropped a degree, or maybe that was just the tension thickening the air. Margaret's chest rose and fell with rapid, uneven breaths, her grip still tight around the gun she had barely been able to fire. Her knuckles were white with the realization that she was no longer in control of anything. The power had shifted completely, irreversibly, and the understanding of that fact played out across her face in slow-burning horror. Evelyn, standing with her back straight and eyes cold and unreadable, barely looked at Margaret before she turned toward the nearest control panel, bringing up the bunker's internal diagnostics. Her movements were controlled, deliberate. She didn't rush, she didn't need to. Margaret and her people had wanted in so badly, had fought, threatened, and even detonated part of her structure to force their way inside, and now they had gotten exactly what they wanted. They had walked straight into a prison of their own making. Margaret snapped first. "You think this is some kind of sick joke?" she hissed, stepping forward, her weapon still trembling in her grasp. "You just locked yourself in here with us. What the hell is wrong with you?" Evelyn didn't glance up from the panel as she ran a diagnostic check on the air circulation systems, ensuring that everything remained stable. "I'm not the one who blew a hole in my bunker," she said smoothly. "That was all you." Margaret's face twisted, her breathing ragged, her desperation bubbling just beneath the surface. "You can't keep us down here." Evelyn's gaze finally flicked up, her expression unreadable. "No." A thick silence settled between them, stretching unbearably long as Margaret clenched her teeth, her fingers tightening around the gun. Behind her, Richard was still pressing a hand against his bleeding temple from where Evelyn had struck him earlier, his eyes darting between her and the two incapacitated men on the floor. The hired muscle that Margaret had brought with her was groaning, the one Evelyn had shot, pressing a trembling hand to his wounded shoulder. His breath was shallow but controlled. He was trained, he knew how to handle pain, but he also knew that they were severely outmatched. He didn't even try to reach for his weapon again. Margaret, however, still clung to whatever delusions of authority she had left. "You think this means you win?" she spat, her voice hoarse but still clinging to that last shred of defiance. "You think just because you trapped us down here, you get to call the shots?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering the question like it was a genuine thought worth entertaining. Then, after a deliberate pause, she shrugged. "Yes." Margaret let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself that this wasn't happening, that she could still salvage whatever plan she had. "No, you don't. You're outnumbered." Evelyn let her words sit for a moment, then glanced at the two men writhing in pain on the ground, then at Richard, who looked like he had already checked out of this disaster completely, then at the wounded mercenary still trying to regulate his breathing. Then she turned back to Margaret. "Are you sure about that?" Margaret hesitated just for a second, but it was enough for doubt to creep in, for the reality of the situation to dig its claws into whatever fantasy she had spun in her head about how this was all supposed to go. That hesitation was all Evelyn needed. She moved fast, closing the space between them before Margaret could react, before she could raise the gun properly. Evelyn's hand clamped around Margaret's wrist, twisting with just enough force to disarm her without breaking bone. The gun clattered uselessly to the ground. Margaret stumbled, trying to reclaim some footing, but Evelyn had already shoved her back, her body slamming against the steel bulkhead, the wind momentarily knocked out of her lungs. She gasped, her eyes wide, stunned not just by the force of the attack, but by how fast it had happened, how little control she had left. Evelyn stepped back, allowing Margaret a second to recover, her own stance perfectly still, like a predator waiting to see if its prey had any fight left. Margaret's breathing was uneven, her face flushed with humiliation, but she didn't try to reach for the gun again. "Good," Evelyn said, bending down to pick up the weapon. She removed the magazine, tossing it across the room, and threw the gun itself into the far corner, out of everyone's reach. She turned to the others, her expression unreadable. "Here's what's going to happen." Richard flinched slightly at the tone, his hand still raised in a subconscious attempt to appear as non-threatening as possible. The mercenary kept his expression blank, but Evelyn could see the calculations running through his head, the subtle way his eyes flicked to the door, to the vent system, analyzing potential exits. "There's no way out until I say there's a way out," Evelyn continued. "You damaged the primary access point with your stun upstairs, and the emergency overrides are only accessible from the main system, which I control. That means we all stay here until I decide otherwise." She let that sink in, watching as the weight of it settled onto their shoulders. "And since you've already proved that you can't be trusted with weapons, you won't be getting them back. If I catch any of you trying to get creative, I will make sure you regret it." Margaret scoffed, her voice dripping with disdain. "Oh, please. What are you going to do? Lock us in separate rooms? Starve us out?" She was trying to sound mocking, dismissive, but there was a nervous edge to it now, a thin veil over the fact that she wasn't as confident as she wanted to be. Evelyn didn't rise to the bait. "You wanted in," she said instead, her voice calm level. "Now you get to see what survival actually looks like." She turned, walking back toward the control panel, tapping a sequence into the console. The lights dimmed slightly, shifting to low-energy mode, a clear sign that resources would now be rationed under her terms. The air circulation adjusted just subtly enough that they would feel the change, a reminder that every breath they took was dependent on her. Margaret didn't speak again. Evelyn sat down in the chair at the main station, crossing one leg over the other, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, watching, waiting. Because this wasn't over, not yet. They still had hours to go before the storm outside passed, and down here, Evelyn was about to find out who was truly prepared for the long haul. The hours dragged on in an unbearable, suffocating silence. The storm outside still howled, its winds shaking the reinforced structure of the bunker, but inside, it was deadly still, the kind of stillness that made every breath sound too loud, every movement feel like a threat. Evelyn remained seated at the control panel, her eyes flicking between the security monitors, and the people trapped inside with her. None of them spoke, at least not yet. The weight of their situation had settled over them like a dense fog, pressing into their bones, forcing them to sit with the consequences of their choices. Margaret had slumped against the far wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her body wound tight with barely restrained frustration. Richard had retreated to a corner, his back pressed against the steel bulkhead, his eyes darting between the others like a man trying to figure out who was going to snap first. The wounded mercenary sat on the floor, his shoulders still bleeding sluggishly, his jaw clenched against the pain, but he remained quiet, disciplined. He knew how to endure. The other two, still dazed from Evelyn's earlier counterattack, had finally stopped groaning, though they hadn't tried to move much beyond shifting into more comfortable positions. Evelyn knew what they were all thinking. They were waiting for her to speak first, to offer them a way out, to tell them how this would end. She wasn't going to. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of it settle into their skin, let the isolation of the bunker become real to them in a way that no amount of Margaret's arrogance or misplaced sense of control could deny. She wanted them to feel it, to understand exactly what they had forced themselves into. This wasn't a power struggle anymore. This was survival, and the only person in the room who knew how to survive was her. The first crack came from Richard. His voice was low, hesitant, the bravado he had carried earlier stripped away by exhaustion and the growing fear of the unknown. "How long are you planning to keep us here?" Evelyn didn't look at him immediately. She let the question linger in the air before she finally turned her head, her expression unreadable. "Until the storm clears." Richard swallowed. "And then what?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly, considering the question like it actually mattered. "Then I'll decide what to do with you." Margaret let out a sharp, bitter laugh, though there was no real humor in it. "Oh, listen to you," she sneered, her voice hoarse but still clinging to that last shred of defiance. "Acting like some dictator in your little underground kingdom. You really think this changes anything? That when we get out of here, you're just going to go back to living your little isolationist fantasy? You have no idea what you've done." Evelyn met Margaret's glare with a cool, unwavering stare. "What I've done," she repeated, her voice even. "Margaret, I didn't invite you here. You broke in. You brought explosives. You tried to take something that wasn't yours, and now you're upset that it didn't go the way you planned. That's not my problem. That's yours." Margaret's jaw tightened, but for once, she had nothing to say. Evelyn leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but her presence still commanding. "Here's how this is going to work," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I have supplies. I have control over the air, the power, and the locks. You do not. You will sit here, and you will wait. When the storm passes, I will open the doors, and you will leave. If you try anything between now and then, I will make sure you regret it." The threat wasn't spoken with malice or dramatics. It was a simple, undeniable fact. Margaret pressed her lips together, fury burning behind her eyes, but she didn't argue. For the next few hours, the tension simmered, but no one tested Evelyn again. The wounded mercenary finally accepted a roll of gauze that she tossed in his direction, though she made it clear that was the only charity he would be receiving from her. The others sat in tense silence, the occasional shifting of bodies the only real movement in the bunker. Margaret refused to look at anyone, her pride still too thick to allow for even the smallest admission of failure. Evelyn kept watch, her senses never fully relaxing. She had seen what people became when they were backed into corners. Some folded, some waited, and some lashed out when you least expected it. She had learned a long time ago to never assume a threat was gone just because it had gone quiet. The storm finally began to weaken around dawn. The winds died down first, then the rain, the relentless pounding against the earth fading into a dull, sporadic patter. By the time the first hints of morning light began to creep through the cracks in the upper-level blast doors, the worst had passed. Evelyn waited another hour before she moved. She didn't say anything at first, simply stood from her chair, stretched out the stiffness in her limbs, then turned to the main control panel and began the unlock sequence. The sound of metal bolts sliding back into place filled the bunker, the hydraulic release of pressure marking the return of their freedom. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "That's it?" she asked, suspicion laced in every syllable. You're just letting us walk out? Evelyn met her gaze with something that almost resembled amusement. Did you think I was going to kill you? Margaret didn't answer, but her silence was telling. Evelyn smirked. You're not worth a bullet. She turned toward the exit, motioning toward the now open blast doors. Get out. Richard didn't hesitate. He pushed himself up, helping the injured mercenary to his feet, his movements stiff, cautious, but grateful to be leaving. The other two followed, each throwing uncertain glances at Evelyn, but they knew better than to linger. They weren't looking for another fight. They had learned their lesson. Margaret, however, didn't move right away. She stood, rolling her shoulders, inhaling slowly, forcing herself back into some semblance of composure. When she finally stepped forward, she paused just long enough to glance at Evelyn over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. This isn't over, she murmured. Evelyn didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't rise to the bait. She simply watched as Margaret walked through the open doors, stepping back into a world that no longer belonged to her. The moment the last of them were gone, Evelyn re-engaged the locks, sealing the bunker behind her. She listened as the sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, then turned back toward the control panel, exhaling slowly. It was over for now. She knew Margaret. She knew what kind of person she was. She wouldn't let this go. She would lick her wounds, rewrite the narrative in her own mind, and come back with something worse. That was fine. Evelyn had always been prepared for the worst. The storm had passed, but the tension in Willow Creek was far from over. The neighborhood was in shambles, trees uprooted, roofs torn off, and streets flooded. The residents who had evacuated were slowly returning, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. The storm had been a wake-up call, a reminder of how fragile their lives truly were. Evelyn Hart, however, remained in her bunker. She had no intention of rejoining the chaos above. Her home was secure, her supplies plentiful, and her resolve unshaken. She had survived the storm, both the natural one and the human one that had tried to breach her sanctuary. But she knew better than to let her guard down. Margaret Langston was not the type to accept defeat gracefully. As the days passed, Evelyn monitored the neighborhood through her security cameras. She saw the cleanup crews working tirelessly, the neighbors helping each other rebuild, and the occasional police car patrolling the streets. But she also saw Margaret. The woman was everywhere, her presence as domineering as ever. She was organizing relief efforts, holding meetings, and, most concerning to Evelyn, talking to anyone who would listen. Evelyn didn't need to hear the conversations to know what Margaret was saying. She was spinning the narrative, painting Evelyn as the villain, the selfish recluse who had hoarded resources while others suffered. It was only a matter of time before Margaret's words turned into action. Margaret Langston was not one to let a grudge go. The humiliation of being locked in Evelyn's bunker, of being outmaneuvered and outsmarted, burned in her chest like a wildfire. She had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the rules. But Evelyn had shattered that illusion, and Margaret was determined to make her pay. She started small, spreading rumors about Evelyn's bunker. She told anyone who would listen that Evelyn had stockpiled enough supplies to last years, that she had weapons, that she was a danger to the community. At first, people were skeptical. Evelyn had always been an outsider, but she had never caused any trouble. Still, Margaret was persistent, and fear was a powerful motivator. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into murmurs, and the murmurs into demands. People began to question why Evelyn was allowed to live on the edge of the neighborhood, why she didn't contribute to the community, why she had so much when others had so little. Margaret stoked the flames, feeding their fears and their anger. By the end of the week, a group of residents had gathered at Margaret's house. They were angry, scared, and desperate. They wanted answers, and they wanted action. Margaret stood before them, her voice calm but commanding. "We've tried to reason with her," she said, her tone dripping with false sincerity. "We've tried to make her see that we're all in this together. But Evelyn Hart doesn't care about this community. She doesn't care about any of us. She's hoarding resources that could save lives, and she's hiding behind her walls like a coward." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger growing with every word. "We can't let her get away with this," Margaret continued. "We can't let one person put all of us at risk. We need to take action. We need to show her that she can't just ignore the rest of us." The crowd erupted into cheers, their fear and frustration finding an outlet in Margaret's words. They didn't stop to question her motives or consider the consequences. They were too caught up in the moment, too eager to believe that they were doing the right thing. Margaret smiled. The pieces were falling into place. Evelyn saw them coming long before they reached her property. Her security cameras picked up the group as they marched down the street, their faces set with determination. She recognized some of them. Neighbors she had never spoken to, people she had seen at community meetings but never interacted with. And at the front of the group was Margaret, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Evelyn sighed. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but she had always known it was a possibility. Margaret was too proud, too vindictive to let things go. And now she had convinced others to join her crusade. Evelyn activated the bunker's defenses, sealing the doors and reinforcing the windows. She didn't want to hurt anyone, but she wasn't about to let them take what was hers. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let a mob dictate her life. The group reached her property, their voices loud and angry. They shouted demands, threats, and pleas, their words blending into a cacophony of noise. Margaret stepped forward, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Evelyn," she called, her tone sharp and commanding. "We know you're in there. You can't hide forever. We're not leaving until you come out and face us." Evelyn didn't respond. She watched through the cameras as the group grew more agitated, their frustration boiling over. Some of them began to pound on the doors, while others tried to find a way around the perimeter. But Evelyn's defenses held firm. The metal barriers, the reinforced locks, the motion sensors, they were all designed to keep intruders out, and they worked exactly as intended. Margaret's frustration grew with every passing minute. She had expected Evelyn to cave, to open the doors and beg for mercy. But Evelyn was silent, her presence felt but unseen. It was infuriating. "Fine," Margaret shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "If you won't come out, we'll make you come out." She turned to the group, her eyes blazing with determination. "We're not leaving until we get what we came for. We'll tear this place apart if we have to." The crowd roared in agreement, their anger fueling their actions. They began to search for tools, for anything they could use to break through the defenses. But Evelyn was ready. She had anticipated this, and she had prepared for it. She activated the sprinkler system, but instead of water, thick plumes of tear gas erupted from the hidden nozzles. The group stumbled back, coughing and gagging as the gas filled the air. Margaret covered her face with her sleeve, her eyes streaming with tears, but she refused to back down. "You think this will stop us?" she shouted, her voice hoarse and strained. "You think you can just gas us and we'll go away? You're wrong, Evelyn. You're wrong." Evelyn watched as the group retreated, their bravado shattered by the gas. But she knew this wasn't over. Margaret wasn't the type to give up, and neither was she. The days that followed were tense. The group returned several times, each time more determined than the last. They tried everything, breaking through the windows, cutting the power, even attempting to dig under the perimeter fence. But Evelyn's defenses held firm. She had thought of everything, and she wasn't about to let them win. Margaret, however, was growing desperate. Her influence over the group was waning, and she knew it. They were tired, frustrated, and beginning to question whether this was worth it. But Margaret couldn't let it go. She had staked her reputation on this, and she wasn't about to admit defeat. One night, under the cover of darkness, Margaret made her move. She had spent hours studying the bunker's layout, looking for any weakness she could exploit. And she thought she had found one, a maintenance tunnel that led to the emergency exit. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance she had. She gathered a small group of loyal followers and led them to the tunnel. They moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the entrance. This was it. This was her moment. But Evelyn was ready. She had anticipated this move, and she had prepared for it. As Margaret and her group entered the tunnel, they triggered a series of motion sensors. The lights flickered on, blinding them momentarily, and then the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. Margaret's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she realized what had happened. She was trapped, and there was no way out. She pounded on the doors, her fists aching with the effort, but they didn't budge. "Evelyn," she screamed, her voice echoing through the tunnel. "Let us out. You can't do this." But Evelyn didn't respond. She watched through the cameras as Margaret and her group struggled, their desperation growing with every passing minute. She had given them every chance to walk away, but they had refused. Now they would face the consequences. The next morning, Evelyn opened the doors to the tunnel. Margaret and her group stumbled out, their faces pale and their bodies trembling with exhaustion. They had spent the night in the cold, dark tunnel, their bravado shattered by the reality of their situation. Margaret looked at Evelyn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. "You think you've won," she said, her voice trembling. "But this isn't over. It will never be over." Evelyn met her gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "It's over, Margaret. You've lost. And if you ever come near me or my property again, I won't be so merciful." Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She knew she had been defeated, and there was nothing she could do to change that. She turned and walked away, her head bowed in shame. The rest of the group followed, their spirits broken. They had been led astray by Margaret's lies, and now they were paying the price. But Evelyn didn't feel any satisfaction in their defeat. She had only wanted to be left alone, to live her life in peace. But the world had other plans. As she watched them leave, Evelyn felt a sense of relief. The storm had passed, both literally and figuratively. She had survived, and she had protected what was hers. But she knew that the world outside her bunker was still a dangerous place, and she would always need to be ready for the next threat. Evelyn sat alone in her bunker, the world outside slowly returning to normal. The storm had left its mark, but the neighborhood was rebuilding. People were helping each other, coming together in ways they never had before. But Evelyn knew that some things would never change. Margaret Langston was gone. She had left Willow Creek shortly after the confrontation, her reputation in tatters. The residents had turned on her, blaming her for the chaos and the destruction. But Evelyn didn't feel any satisfaction in her downfall. She had only wanted to be left alone, and now, finally, she was. But she knew that the world was still a dangerous place, and she would always need to be ready. The bunker was her sanctuary, her last stronghold, and she would defend it, no matter what. As she sat in the dim light of the control room, Evelyn felt a sense of peace. She had survived the storm, and she had survived the people who had tried to take what was hers. She was strong, resilient, and unyielding, and she would continue to be, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The last stronghold was hers, and she would defend it, no matter the cost. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.